I'll take her. 3 words. That was all it took. 3 words spoken in a voice so quiet that the auctioneer had to ask him to repeat himself, and when the Duke of Kingsley did repeat himself, in exactly the same tone, at exactly the same volume, with exactly the same terrifying calm, the room fell so silent you could hear the candles burning. He was not looking at the auctioneer. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at the woman standing at the far end of the platform, the one in the heavy black veil, the one whose face no one in this room had ever seen, the one they had been calling the ugly duckling all evening with the casual, laughing cruelty of people who have never themselves been unwanted. "I'll take her," he said again, "and if anyone bids against me, I will consider it a personal offence." No one bid against him. No one ever bid against the Duke of Kingsley. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the smell of candle wax and roses, the rustle of silk against marble floors, the distant strain of a string quartet playing something melancholy. Now imagine that everyone in the room is watching you, not with admiration, but with pity. This is where our story begins tonight on Aristocratic Hearts. Before we step into that ballroom together, tell me where you're joining from. Your city, your time, your current mood. I want to know. We are a global community here, and every comment reminds me that stories connect us across every boundary. Tonight's story is about a woman who was put on a stage and sold like furniture. Not because she was worthless, but because the people who should have protected her decided she was worth more as a spectacle than as a daughter. It is about a duke who walked into an auction with no intention of bidding on anyone, and walked out with the one woman the entire room had written off. And it is about the moment, 3 weeks later, when he lifted her veil and discovered that the ugly duckling they had laughed at was hiding something that would bring the most powerful man in England to his knees. Not because of what she looked like, because of what they had done to her. The year was 1847, and Viola Ashcroft was 23 years old and running out of time. Now, in 1847 England, the phrase running out of time had a very specific meaning for a woman of gentle birth. It meant she was unmarried. It meant the London season, that annual parade of eligible young women through ballrooms and drawing rooms and garden parties, all in desperate pursuit of a husband, had come and gone 5 times without producing a single offer. It meant that society, which kept careful count of such things the way a banker keeps count of debts, had quietly moved her from the category of eligible to the category of hopeless. The London season was not merely a calendar of entertainments, it was a marriage market, operating with the ruthless efficiency of the London Stock Exchange. Families invested hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds in gowns, carriages and townhouse rentals, all for the chance to display their daughters before eligible men like goods in a shop window. A young woman typically had 2 or 3 seasons to secure a match. After that, the whispers began. On the shelf, past her prime, a spinster in the making. And the whispers, once they started, had a way of becoming prophecy. Because in a world where a woman's entire future depended on one man choosing her, the perception of being unwanted was almost as damaging as the reality. Viola had endured 5 seasons. 5 years of standing at the edge of ballrooms in dresses that were never quite new enough, never quite fashionable enough, watching her younger sister Delphine be swept onto the dance floor by one eager suitor after another, while Viola counted the cracks in the plaster and pretended she could not hear what the matrons were whispering behind their fans. Plain Viola, poor Viola. What a pity about the Ashcroft girl. The elder one, I mean. Not the beauty, the other one, the other one. That was what she had been for as long as she could remember. The other Ashcroft daughter. The one who came before Delphine, but existed only in her shadow. Where Delphine was golden, corn silk hair, cornflower eyes, a face so symmetrically perfect that a painter had once asked Sir Piers if he could use her as a model for an angel. Viola was brown. Brown hair, brown eyes, brown as a sparrow in a garden full of peacocks. Her features were not ugly. They were simply unremarkable. A face you might see and immediately forget, the kind of face that moved through rooms without leaving an impression, the kind of face that society, in its infinite cruelty, had decided was not worth looking at twice. Sir Piers Ashcroft had made his feelings on the matter clear from the beginning. He was a baronet of moderate fortune and immoderate vanity, the kind of man who measured his own worth by the beauty of the things he possessed, and who had regarded his first daughter's ordinary appearance as a personal affront. His wife, Lady Sylvia Ashcroft, had died bringing Delphine into the world, or so the family believed, and Sir Piers, confronted with one plain daughter of 7 and one golden infant, had made his choice immediately and without apology. Delphine would be raised as the jewel of the family. Viola would be raised as the setting, present, functional, invisible. She was not mistreated. That would have required Sir Piers to pay attention to her, which he did not. She was simply overlooked with such thoroughness that by the time she was 15, Viola had learned to move through Ashcroft Hall like a ghost, occupying rooms without being noticed, eating meals without being addressed, existing in the spaces between the family's attention, the way dust exists in the spaces between furniture. She read. She read voraciously and indiscriminately, novels, histories, philosophy, natural science, the kind of books that would have made a drawing-room matron faint. She taught herself French from her mother's old books and Italian from a grammar she found in the attic. She learned to sketch, not beautifully, but accurately, recording the birds in the garden and the wildflowers along the hedgerows with the careful precision of someone cataloguing a world she was not fully part of. She kept a journal. She wrote letters to no one. She developed a dry, quick wit that she had no occasion to use because no one asked Viola Ashcroft her opinion on anything. And she waited. Not for rescue. Viola did not believe in rescue. She waited for the season to be over, year after year, so she could go back to the country and be quietly invisible among the hedgerows instead of publicly invisible in a ballroom. But this year, 1847, her 5th season, the year she turned 23. Something changed. Sir Piers Ashcroft had debts. Not the ordinary debts of a gentleman who had overspent on his townhouse or his horses. Real debts. Catastrophic debts. The kind of debts that arrived in the form of solicitors' letters and collection agents, and the very real threat of losing Ashcroft Hall, the family seat, the only piece of England that bore his name. The specifics are important because they explain what happened next. Sir Piers had invested heavily in a railway scheme, one of the dozens of speculative ventures that proliferated through England in the 1840s like mushrooms after rain. The scheme had collapsed. The investors were ruined. Sir Piers, who had leveraged the estate against his investment, now owed £14,000 to creditors who had no interest in patience and even less in mercy. £14,000. To understand the scale of this disaster, consider that a comfortable gentleman's income was perhaps £500 per year. £14,000 was 28 years of comfort. It was a fortune. And Sir Piers did not have it. What he had were 2 daughters, one golden, one plain, and he had an invitation. The Countess of Pemberton's charity auction, held annually at Pemberton House in Mayfair, was, on its surface, a genteel fundraising event for the Society for the Relief of Distressed Gentlewomen. Ladies of good birth donated their time and company for an evening, and gentlemen bid on the privilege, with all proceeds going to charity. It was civilized. It was respectable. It was, in 1847, the closest thing English society had to a marriage market that admitted what it actually was. But everyone knew the unspoken truth. The auction was where certain desperate families presented their daughters with the understanding that a generous bid might lead to a courtship, a proposal, and a settlement that would save the family from ruin. It was not selling daughters, not technically, but the line between charity and commerce had grown so thin you could see through it. Sir Piers intended to auction Delphine. Now, it is important to understand the economics of what Sir Piers was attempting. In this era, a young woman's marriage prospects were inseparable from her dowry, the sum of money or property her family provided to her husband upon marriage. A generous dowry could elevate a plain woman to desirability. An absent dowry could render even a beauty unmarketable. The transaction was naked, though dressed in the language of romance. Families negotiated dowries the way merchants negotiated shipping contracts, with hard numbers, sharp terms, and very little sentiment. A woman without a dowry was a woman without options, and Sir Piers, who had gambled away his daughter's dowries along with everything else, was now attempting to use beauty itself as currency, to substitute Delphine's face for the money he no longer had. Golden Delphine, 20 years old, the most beautiful debutante of her year, would stand on that platform and attract bids that would dwarf anything the charity had seen. A man, a wealthy man, a titled man, would bid generously, and that bid would open a door, and through that door would come a proposal, a dowry negotiation, a settlement that would include enough money to satisfy the creditors and save the estate. It was a gamble, but not a large one. Delphine was the kind of woman men spent money on. The plan was elegant. The plan was simple. The plan worked perfectly until the morning of the auction, when Delphine Ashcroft locked her bedroom door from the inside, climbed out of the window, and eloped with a lieutenant of the Dragoon Guards she had been meeting in secret for 3 months. She left a note. It said, "I'm sorry, Papa. I love him." Sir Piers read the note at 8:30 in the morning. The auction was at 7 that evening. He had 11 hours to find a replacement, or the family was finished. He looked at Viola. "I have to pause here and tell you something, because this is the moment the story turns, and I want you to understand exactly what Viola was feeling." She was sitting in the morning room reading a translation of Dante, the Inferno, as it happened, which would later strike her as grimly appropriate, when her father walked in. She had not seen him enter a room she occupied in perhaps 3 months. She knew before he opened his mouth that something was very wrong. "You will take your sister's place at the auction tonight," he said. Not a question, not a request, a statement of fact, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who has spent 23 years treating his eldest daughter as an afterthought and sees no reason to change now. Viola set down her book. "I beg your pardon? Delphine has gone. You are the only option." He said it the way a man might say, "The good wine is finished. Bring the ordinary." "Father, no one will bid on me." "No," Sir Piers agreed. "They will not. That is why you will wear a veil." The silence that followed was the loudest silence of Viola's life. "A veil," she repeated. "A heavy one. You will not speak. You will not be identified. The gentleman will see the Ashcroft name on the programme and assume it is Delphine. By the time they discover otherwise, a bid will have been placed, and the family's honour, such as it is, will be preserved." Viola looked at her father. She looked at the Dante in her lap. "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And she thought about saying no. She thought about the fact that she was being asked to stand on a stage disguised as her beautiful sister and be sold to a man who would take one look at her plain face and feel cheated. She thought about the humiliation, the exposure, the inevitable, devastating moment when the veil came off and the room discovered that Golden Delphine was in fact ordinary Viola, and Then she thought about the servants at Ashcroft Hall, Mrs. Bramwell, who had been the cook for 30 years, old Tompkins, who tended the garden on knees that cracked like gunshots every morning, who would lose their positions if the estate was sold. She thought about the tenants on the home farm who depended on the Ashcroft family for their livelihood. She thought about the debts and the creditors, and the fact that none of this was her fault, but all of it would be her consequence. "Very well," she said. Sir Piers nodded once, turned and left the room without thanking her. Viola sat in the morning room for a long time after he left. She did not cry. Viola Ashcroft had stopped crying at the age of 12, when she realized that tears required an audience to be effective, and she had never had an audience for anything. The veil was black, Brussels lace, heavy enough to obscure her features completely. Sir Piers had it delivered to her room at 4 o'clock, along with Delphine's dress, a gown of pale blue silk that had been made for a body shaped nothing like Viola's. The seamstress did what she could in 3 hours. The result was imperfect. The bodice was too tight across the shoulders and too loose at the waist. The colour, which made Delphine look like a spring morning, made Viola look like a woman wearing someone else's clothes, which was precisely what she was. She stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom and looked at herself. The ill-fitting dress, the heavy veil, the shape of a woman prepared for sale. And she said, out loud, to no one, "I am the ugly duckling." She said it without self-pity. She said it the way a scientist might state a fact. "The earth is round, water flows downhill, I am the ugly duckling." It was observation, not complaint. She had been the ugly duckling for 23 years, and she had made a science of surviving it. The carriage arrived at 6. Pemberton House was ablaze with candlelight. Hundreds of beeswax candles in crystal chandeliers that cast the vast ballroom in amber and gold. The auction platform had been erected at the far end of the room, draped in velvet, flanked by arrangements of hothouse flowers that must have cost more than a maid's annual salary. The cream of London society had turned out, not for the charity, of course, but for the spectacle. A charity auction was entertainment. It was gossip. It was the chance to see which desperate family had finally run out of options and was offering a daughter to the highest bidder under the polite fiction of philanthropy. There were 6 women on the programme. Viola was the last. She stood at the edge of the platform, behind a silk screen, and listened to the first 5 women being auctioned. A widow of 40 who received polite bids for a dinner. A young woman with a limp who was offered a carriage ride, a clergyman's daughter who attracted modest interest. Each presentation was accompanied by the auctioneer's practiced patter, good family, excellent health, accomplished in needlework, the language of livestock sales, dressed in evening clothes. And then it was her turn. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, consulting his programme, "our final lot of the evening, Miss Ashcroft of the Devonshire Ashcrofts." The murmur that went through the room was immediate. Everyone knew the Ashcroft name. Everyone knew Delphine, the beautiful one, the golden one. Men shifted forward in their seats. Fans snapped open. The interest was palpable. Viola stepped onto the platform. The murmur became a different sound, not anticipation, confusion, because the woman on the platform was not Delphine Ashcroft. She was the wrong height, too tall by 2 inches, the wrong shape, broader in the shoulder, narrower in the hip, and she was veiled, completely, heavily, impenetrably veiled in black Brussels lace that showed nothing of her face, her hair, her expression. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, and her chin lifted and her spine straight, and she said nothing at all. "Miss Ashcroft will be offering the pleasure of her company for an evening's entertainment," the auctioneer continued, his voice wobbling slightly. He had been told to expect Delphine. He did not know what to do with this. "Do I hear an opening bid?" Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. the kind that presses down on the person standing at its center and says, "You are not wanted here." "That's not Delphine," someone whispered, loudly enough for Viola to hear. "Who is it? Why is she veiled?" "It must be the other one, the plain one. Good God, Ashcroft is trying to sell the ugly Duckling." The laughter was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the precise, contained laughter of people who have been trained in cruelty since birth, who know exactly how to make a joke cut without raising their voices. Viola heard every syllable. She felt the laughter, the way she had felt every slight, every dismissal, every turned back and empty dance card for 23 years. She felt it, and she did not move. She stood on that platform in her sister's dress and her black veil, and she refused, with every fibre of her body, to let them see her flinch. "Do I hear an opening bid?" the auctioneer repeated, and the desperation in his voice was audible now. £5, perhaps. For charity. Nothing. Sir Piers, standing at the edge of the room, had gone the colour of old plaster. His gamble had failed. The room knew. They all knew. £2, the auctioneer tried. In the audience a man snickered. Another shook his head with theatrical pity. A woman leaned to her companion and whispered something that made them both laugh. The sound carried across the room like breaking glass. Viola counted to 10. She counted because it gave her something to do besides feel, and feeling at this moment would have destroyed her. She was at 7 when she heard it. £1,000. The room went silent, as if someone had drawn a blade. Viola's count stopped at 7. She would not reach 8 for a very long time. The voice had come from the back of the room. It was quiet, not soft, but quiet in the way that truly dangerous things are quiet. A voice accustomed to being heard without raising itself. A voice that expected obedience the way the tide expects the shore. Every head turned. He was standing in the doorway. He had not been there a moment ago. Or perhaps he had, and no one had noticed, which was remarkable given that he was 6 feet and 2 inches of precisely tailored black wool and barely contained menace. Dark hair, cut short. A jaw that looked like it had been designed to deliver verdicts. Grey eyes that swept the room without warmth, without interest, without anything at all except a cold, absolute authority that made the air in the ballroom feel thinner. The Duke of Kingsley. Now, if you have been listening to these stories, you know what a duke was in 1847 England. But this duke, Cornelius Drayton, the 5th Duke of Kingsley, occupied a category beyond mere aristocratic power. His income was £45,000 per year. He owned estates in 4 counties. He sat in the House of Lords with the casual authority of a man who knew that his vote could make or break a government. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and the subject of more speculation, more gossip, and more fear than any other man in English society. Fear is the word that matters. Because the Duke of Kingsley was not merely wealthy or powerful. He was, by universal consensus, terrifying. Not in the way of a bully or a tyrant. There was no cruelty in him that anyone could point to. He was terrifying the way a winter storm is terrifying. Impersonal, vast, and utterly indifferent to what you wanted. He had destroyed a man's political career over a broken promise. He had bankrupted a shipping company that cheated his tenants. He had, according to a rumour that no one could confirm but everyone believed, once looked a man in the eye and said, "I will dismantle everything you have built," and then done precisely that. He did not attend social functions. He did not dance. He did not make small talk, and he most certainly did not attend charity auctions until tonight. £1,000, he said again, walking forward, the crowd parting for him, the way a field of wheat parts for a scythe. For the lady in the veil. The auctioneer looked like he was about to faint. Your Grace, we are honoured by your... Did you say 1,000? I said 1,000. The Duke stopped 10 feet from the platform. His grey eyes found Viola, found the black veil, the ill-fitting dress, the rigid spine, and something moved behind his expression that not a single person in that room could read. Does anyone wish to bid against me? It was not a question. It was a warning. Going once, the auctioneer said, his voice cracking. Going twice. Sold. To His Grace, the Duke of Kingsley, for £1,000. The room erupted. Not in applause, in shock, in whispers that hissed through the ballroom like wind through dead leaves. £1,000 for the ugly Duckling, for the veiled woman no one wanted. The Duke of Kingsley, the most powerful, most feared, most eligible man in England, had just spent a fortune on a woman whose face he had never seen. Why? Viola stood on the platform, trembling beneath her veil, asking herself the same question. She was still asking it 3 hours later, sitting in the drawing-room of Pemberton House with a cup of tea she could not bring herself to drink, when the door opened and the Duke of Kingsley walked in. He closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was very quiet. He stood just inside the room, hands clasped behind his back, regarding her with those grey eyes that gave nothing away. You are not Delphine Ashcroft, he said. It was not a question. No, Viola said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. I am not. You are the elder sister, the one they call Plain. Yes, the one who reads Dante in the morning room. Viola's breath stopped. How do you know that? The Duke did not answer immediately. He walked to the fireplace, stood with his back to the flames, and studied her with the focused attention of a man examining something he has been thinking about for a very long time. I will be direct, he said. I despise indirectness. I have watched you, Miss Ashcroft. Not your sister. You. For 3 years, at every ball, every dinner, every event where your family has presented Delphine like a prize horse at a county fair, I have watched you sit in corners with books you think no one notices. I have watched you correct a diplomat on the Treaty of Vienna and pretend it was a cough. I have watched you give your supper to a servant's child when you thought no one was looking. I have watched you endure 5 seasons of public humiliation with more dignity than anyone I have ever met. Viola could not speak. She could not breathe. I came tonight because I knew your father intended to auction Delphine, and I knew, because I make it my business to know things, that he was in financial distress. I intended to bid on her and use the purchase as leverage to negotiate a meeting with you. With you. Not your sister. He paused. His jaw tightened. Something hot and bright moved behind his grey eyes before his control extinguished it. Imagine my surprise, he said quietly, when the woman who walked onto that platform was not the Golden Sister at all, but the one I actually wanted. The silence in the drawing room was absolute. You wanted me, Viola repeated. I want you. Present tense, not past. I want to marry you tonight, if possible, tomorrow, if propriety demands. I want you as my wife, my Duchess, and the mother of my children. I want you, Viola Ashcroft, and I am not accustomed to wanting things I cannot have. You have never seen my face. I have seen you. The distinction landed like a blow. Not her face. Her. The reading. The wit. The quiet endurance, the way she gave food to children and corrected diplomats and survived 5 years of cruelty without breaking. Take off the veil, he said, not a command, an invitation. You might be disappointed. I might be. I will not be. Viola's hands were shaking. She lifted them to the black Brussels lace, hesitated, and then, because she had spent 23 years being invisible and was suddenly, devastatingly tired of it, she pulled the veil from her face. She was not beautiful. She knew that. Brown hair, brown eyes, a face that was interesting rather than lovely. Strong brows, a mouth that curved when she was thinking, freckles across her nose that no amount of powder could disguise. A face that rooms forgot. A face that society had dismissed for 23 years. The Duke of Kingsley looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. And then he did something that Viola Ashcroft, plain Viola, poor Viola, the ugly duckling, had never in her 23 years of life seen a man do. His expression changed. The cold, controlled, terrifying mask that he showed the world cracked, and behind it was something raw and unguarded, and so nakedly tender that it stole the breath from her lungs. "There you are," he said, as if he had been looking for her, as if he had been looking for her his entire life. "Your Grace?" "Cornelius," he said. "My name is Cornelius, and you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever seen." "I am not extraordinary," Viola said. "I am plain. Everyone says so." "Everyone," the Duke of Kingsley said, "is a fool." He crossed the room. He stood in front of her. He was very tall. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. And up close, the coldness she had seen in the ballroom was gone entirely. Up close, his eyes were the grey of morning fog, and they were looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. "Will you marry me, Viola? You don't know me. I know you read Dante before breakfast. I know you speak French and Italian and can identify 14 species of British songbirds by their calls. I know you gave your winter coat to a housemaid last December and told your father you lost it. I know you have survived 23 years of being treated as invisible with your intelligence and your kindness entirely intact." He paused. "What else do I need to know?" "There is something else," Viola said, and her voice changed. The steadiness wavered. Something dark and heavy moved beneath her words. "Something about my family, something they have done, something I have been hiding. Tell me." "Not yet." She looked up at him, brown eyes meeting grey. "Marry me first, and then I will tell you." "Everything." "Why not now?" "Because if I tell you now, you will destroy them before the wedding. And I need the wedding to happen first, for the servants, for the tenants, for the people who depend on my family's estate, and who will lose everything if the creditors foreclose." The Duke studied her. She watched him process this. The strategic thinking, the self-sacrifice, the fact that even now, even in this moment, she was thinking about the people who depended on her rather than herself. "Very well," he said. "We marry first, you tell me after." And then his grey eyes went cold, not toward her, toward whoever had hurt her, toward the something she was hiding. And then the Duke of Kingsley said, "I will do what I do best." Viola looked at this man, this powerful, terrifying, tender man who had walked into an auction and chosen her, who had watched her for 3 years without her knowledge, who had just proposed marriage to a woman everyone else called the ugly Duckling. And she felt something she had not felt in 23 years of invisibility. She felt seen. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." The wedding took place 4 days later. Not in a cathedral. The Duke of Kingsley did not care for cathedrals, but in the private chapel at Kingsley Park, his estate in Devonshire, a room of ancient stone and candlelight and silence that felt, to Viola, like stepping into another century entirely. Now, it is important to understand what a marriage meant for a woman in 1847 England, because it changes everything about what happened next. Under the laws of coverture, and I want you to remember that word, coverture, because it explains so much about why women in this era made the choices they did. The moment a woman spoke her wedding vows, she ceased to exist as an independent legal person. Her property, if she had any, became her husband's property. Her income, if she earned any, became his income. Her children, if she bore them, belonged to him. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue in court. She could not own a business. She could not keep her own wages. In the eyes of the law, she was absorbed into her husband like a river absorbed into the sea. Still there, still flowing, but no longer separate, no longer her own. When Viola stood at that altar, she was not merely choosing a husband. She was choosing to place her entire existence into the hands of a man she had known for 4 days. Everything she was, her body, her future, her secrets, would belong to him. She wore white, not Delphine's blue silk, but a gown of ivory satin that the Duke's household had commissioned from a London dressmaker, with instructions that must have been remarkable in their specificity, because the gown fit Viola. Not some idealized version of a woman, but Viola herself, her shoulders, her height, her particular shape, as if it had been designed for no one else, as if someone had been studying her measurements for a very long time. She did not wear a veil. The Duke of Kingsley had been very clear about that. No veil, no disguise, no hiding. She would stand at the altar with her plain, freckled, extraordinary face visible to every person in the chapel, and she would be married as herself. Sir Piers attended. He had no choice. The Duke had made his attendance a condition of the financial arrangement, which was generous enough to erase the debts, and ruthless enough to strip Sir Piers of any illusion that he was in control. The creditors would be satisfied. Ashcroft Hall would be saved. The tenants and servants would keep their positions. In exchange, Sir Piers would sign over Viola's dowry, such as it was, and attend the wedding with a smile that would convince society the match was a happy one. Sir Piers smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Delphine was not present. Delphine was in Scotland with her lieutenant, having discovered within weeks of her elopement that romance was considerably less romantic when it involved rented rooms and cold porridge. But that is a story for another time. The ceremony was brief. The chapel was cold. The candles threw long shadows across the stone walls, and Viola's hand trembled when the Duke took it. His hand was warm. That surprised her. She had expected the same coldness she saw in his eyes, the same winter composure. But his hand was warm and steady and very large around hers, and when he spoke his vows, "I, Cornelius Drayton, Duke of Kingsley, take thee, Viola." He said her name as if it meant something, as if it had weight, as if it was not the name of a woman who had been invisible for 23 years, but the name of someone who mattered. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The Duke looked at her. She looked at him. In the candlelight, his grey eyes were almost silver, and in them Viola saw something that made her heart twist. Not desire, not possession, not triumph. Relief, as if he had been holding his breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. He did not kiss her, not in the chapel, not in front of the witnesses, not with Sir Piers watching from the pews with that terrible, empty smile. He simply lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, once gently. And then he led her out of the chapel and into the watery spring sunlight and into her new life. She was the Duchess of Kingsley now. It was a title that felt like a coat, 3 sizes too large, vast and heavy and belonging to someone else entirely. A duchess. The girl who had been overlooked at every ball for 5 years, who had eaten in the kitchen because her father forgot to set a place for her at dinner, who had mended her own stockings because no one thought to buy her new ones. A duchess. The wedding breakfast was held in the great dining hall at Kingsley Park. 20 servants lined the corridor to welcome their new mistress, and every one of them bowed or curtsied as she passed. Viola, who had never been bowed to in her life, had to press her nails into her palms to stop herself from crying. Not from sadness, from the strangeness of being seen. Mrs. Bramwell had come with her. Viola had insisted on this. The old cook from Ashcroft Hall, who had been the closest thing Viola had to a mother for 16 years, who had saved scraps for her when Sir Piers forgot to include her at dinner, who had taught her to make bread and told her stories and brushed her hair on the nights when being invisible became unbearable. The Duke had agreed without hesitation. "Bring anyone you want," he had said. "The house is yours." The house. Kingsley Park was not a house. It was a world. A vast Elizabethan manor surrounded by 1,000 acres of parkland, with gardens that stretched to the horizon, and a library that occupied an entire wing and contained, according to the housekeeper, more than 12,000 volumes. Viola had stood in the doorway of that library on her first evening as Duchess and felt her knees go weak. "You like books," the Duke said from behind her. It was not a question. "I love books," Viola said, and her voice broke on the word love, because she had spent 23 years reading in corners and attics and borrowed light, and now she was standing in a library that could have held every book she had ever wanted. "They're yours," the Duke said, "all of them." Those first weeks were strange and tender and careful, the way new things always are. The Duke was courteous. He was attentive. He dined with her every evening, asked about her reading, listened with genuine interest when she talked about Dante or birdsong or the particular way the light fell across the Devonshire moors at sunset. He did not rush her. He did not push. He behaved in all respects like a man who understood that the woman he had married had never been treated with kindness and needed time to believe that kindness was real. The first time he touched her, truly touched her, not the formal contact of offered arms and handed teacups, was an accident. They were walking in the garden on a cool April evening, and Viola stumbled on a flagstone. His hand caught her elbow. His fingers closed around her arm, steadying her, and the warmth of his grip through the thin fabric of her sleeve sent a shock through her body so acute she gasped. He released her immediately, but not before she felt his thumb press against the inside of her arm. Once, briefly, as if he could not help himself. And the imprint of that touch burned against her skin for hours afterward. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her vast bed, in her vast room, in this vast house that belonged to her husband, and she thought about his thumb against the inside of her arm, and she pressed her own fingers to the spot, and felt her pulse hammering beneath her skin. The second time was deliberate, 3 days later. They were in the library. Their library, she had begun to think of it, and Viola was reaching for a volume on a high shelf, stretching on her toes, her fingers just brushing the spine, when she felt him behind her, not touching, just there. The heat of his body close enough that she could feel it through her dress, the scent of him, cedar and ink and something darker, something that made her mouth go dry, filling the air between them. His arm reached past her. His chest brushed her shoulder. He pulled the book down and held it out to her, and when she turned to take it, their faces were inches apart. She could see the individual lashes framing his grey eyes. She could see the slight unevenness in his lower lip, as if he had been biting it. She could see the pulse beating at his throat. "Thank you," she whispered. He did not step back. He stood there, close enough to kiss, close enough that she could feel his breath against her temple. And he said, "You are welcome," in a voice so low it was barely a vibration in the air. Then he turned and walked to his desk and sat down and picked up his correspondence as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and they both knew it. The tension built like a summer storm, slowly, relentlessly, the pressure increasing day by day until the air between them felt thick enough to choke on. Every evening at dinner, their eyes met across the table and held, and the candles flickered, and the food went cold on their plates, and neither of them acknowledged what was happening, because acknowledging it would mean acting on it. And acting on it was terrifying for different reasons. She was terrified because she had never been wanted. She did not know what to do with desire. She had spent 23 years being the woman no one looked at twice, and the idea that this man, this devastating, powerful, extraordinary man, might want her, the way his eyes suggested he wanted her, was so foreign to her experience that she could not trust it. She kept waiting for the mask to slip, for the coldness to return, for him to wake up one morning and look at her plain, freckled face and think, "What have I done?" He was terrified, though he would have denied it, would have denied being capable of fear, because he had spent 34 years in perfect control, and the woman sitting across from him reading Dante with one finger pressed to her lower lip was dismantling that control with a thoroughness that alarmed him. He had watched her for 3 years. He had planned this marriage with the precision of a military campaign. What he had not planned for was the way her laugh sounded in the empty rooms of Kingsley Park, surprised and bright, as if she herself could not believe the sound was coming from her. Or the way she argued with him about philosophy, not with deference, but with fire, leaning forward in her chair with her brown eyes blazing, or the way she looked in the morning light when she did not know he was watching, her hair loose, her guard down, more beautiful in her unself-consciousness than any woman he had ever seen. On the 14th night, Viola could not sleep. She went to the library. The fire had burned low. She curled into the armchair she had claimed as her own and opened a volume of Keats and tried to read. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the soft fall of bare feet on carpet. He appeared in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his hair disordered, his cravat gone. She had never seen him undone like this. He looked younger. He looked human. He looked like a man who had also been unable to sleep. "Viola," his voice was rough. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Nor could I." He crossed the room. He sat in the chair opposite hers. The fire crackled between them. The light painted his face in amber and shadow. "I keep thinking," he said, and stopped. "About what?" A long silence. The fire popped. "About your arm," he said, "in the garden, when you stumbled." Viola's breath stopped. "I keep thinking about how your skin felt under my hand. I keep thinking about it when I should be thinking about estate accounts and parliamentary business and the 17 other things that require my attention. I keep thinking about the inside of your arm. It is," he paused, and she watched him struggle with something that was clearly costing him enormously. "It is making me quite unable to function." Viola stared at him. The most feared man in England was sitting across from her in his shirt sleeves, confessing that the memory of touching her arm had rendered him incapable of doing his job. "I think about the library," she said quietly, "when you reach past me for the book." His eyes darkened. "I think about how close you were. I think about what would have happened if I had turned my head, if you had not stepped away." "If I had not stepped away," the Duke said very slowly, "I would have kissed you. And if I had kissed you, I would not have stopped." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Viola set down her book. She stood up. She crossed the space between their chairs. 3 steps, that was all. 3 steps across a library in the middle of the night. And she stood in front of him. He looked up at her. His grey eyes were not cold. They were burning. "Then don't stop," she said. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. His hands found her waist, her back, the curve of her jaw, and he kissed her as if the 14 days of restraint had been a dam, and the dam had just broken. His mouth was hungry against hers, not careful, not courteous, not the composed man she had married. This was the man underneath, the man who had watched her for 3 years, the man who wanted. Viola kissed him back. She kissed him back with 23 years of loneliness and wanting, and the absolute bone-deep relief of being desired by someone she desired in return. Her hands found his chest through the thin linen of his shirt, felt the heat of his skin, the rapid hammering of his heart. He groaned against her mouth, a sound that vibrated through her entire body and pulled her closer, closer, until there was no space between them at all. "Viola," he said, and his voice was wrecked. We should, don't you dare be sensible right now." Something broke open in his face. Surprise, delight, a flash of something so tender it made her chest ache. And then he laughed. The Duke of Kingsley laughed. The sound was low and warm and utterly disarming, and Viola realized she had never heard him laugh before. No one had. He lifted her, simply lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out of the library and up the stairs and into the bedroom that had been hers alone for 2 weeks, and would never be hers alone again. He set her down at the edge of the bed and stood before her, and the firelight from the hearth caught the angles of his face, and he looked at her with those grey eyes that had terrified half of England, and they were not terrifying at all. They were asking permission. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." What followed was not what she had expected. She had expected efficiency, perhaps, formality, the mechanical fulfillment of a marital duty. She had not expected tenderness. She had not expected the way his hands shook as he unbraided her hair, pulling pins free one by one with the careful attention of a man unwrapping something precious. She had not expected the way he pressed his lips to her collarbone and whispered, "You are extraordinary," against her skin. She had not expected to feel so entirely, devastatingly, completely safe. He was gentle, and he was patient, and he was thorough, and afterward, lying in the dark with her head on his chest and his arm around her, and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Viola thought, "So this is what it feels like, to be chosen, to be held, to be the opposite of invisible." "Stay," she said. "I was not planning to leave." "Good." He pressed his lips to her hair, his arm tightened around her, and they slept. Together, tangled, warm, for the first time, but not the last. After that night, the careful distance between them vanished. He came to her room every evening, or she came to his, or they met in the library and never made it past the first paragraph. And the days took on a rhythm that felt like breathing, like something necessary and natural and impossible to stop. But Viola could feel it. The thing between them that was not tension anymore, but something heavier, the secret, the truth she was carrying. Every morning she woke in his arms and thought, "Today I will tell him." And every morning she looked at his sleeping face, the hard lines softened, the control relaxed, the man visible beneath the Duke. And she could not bear to break it, could not bear to watch the warmth in his eyes turn to fury, could not bear to be the one who introduced pain into this fragile, extraordinary happiness. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way she knew the Latin names of wildflowers, with certainty, with precision, with the helpless clarity of someone who has studied a thing, until it becomes undeniable. She loved the way he listened. She loved the way he argued with her about Machiavelli, and conceded when she made a better point. She loved the way he terrified everyone in England except her. She loved the way he said her name. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of their marriage, Viola heard something that nearly destroyed everything. She was walking through the east corridor bringing a cup of tea to Mrs. Bramwell in the kitchen when she heard voices coming from the Duke's study. The door was ajar. She did not mean to listen, but she heard her name, and she stopped. "Your Grace, with the greatest respect." It was Mr. Hartigan's voice. The ton is already talking. They are calling it a charity match. They say you married her out of pity. A pause. Then Cornelius, his voice clipped, let them talk. They are saying that you saw a woman no one wanted and you felt sorry for her, that you are playing the hero, that when the novelty wears off, you will install her in the country and take a mistress in London as your father did. Another pause, longer this time. Is that what they say? The Duke said. It was not a question. I tell you this only so you are prepared. The gossip will reach the Duchess eventually, and she should hear it from... She will hear nothing from anyone. I will manage this. Viola stepped back from the door. Her hands were shaking. The teacup rattled against the saucer, and she set it down on the hallway table before she dropped it. A charity match. Pity. The novelty wearing off. She returned to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, their bed, the bed where he had held her, and whispered that she was extraordinary. And she felt the old architecture of her life reassembling around her. The invisible girl, the ugly duckling, the woman no one wanted, married by a man who felt sorry for her. It wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true. She had felt the way he kissed her. She had seen the way he looked at her when he thought she was reading and not watching. She knew. But knowing and believing are different things. And 23 years of being told you are not enough leave marks that do not fade in 3 weeks of happiness. She pulled away. Not dramatically. Viola was not a dramatic woman. She pulled away the way the tide pulls away, slowly and imperceptibly, so that the man standing on the shore does not notice until the water is already gone. She was pleasant at dinner. She was agreeable in the library. She smiled when he spoke to her, and answered his questions and said good night at the appropriate hour. But she stopped reaching for him. She stopped meeting his eyes across the table. She stopped coming to the library at midnight. The Duke noticed in 2 days. Of course he did. He noticed everything about her. He had been noticing everything about her for 3 years. On the second evening, he set down his fork in the middle of dinner and said, "What has changed?" "Nothing has changed." "Something has changed. You are being polite to me." "Is that not desirable?" "It is unbearable." His grey eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Polite is what you were at the auction. Polite is what you were with your father. Polite is the wall you build when you are hiding. I do not want your politeness, Viola. I want you." "Perhaps," Viola said, and her voice was steady, though her hands were not. "You want an idea of me. The clever woman you watched from across ballrooms, the ugly duckling you rescued. Perhaps you want the story of me rather than the reality." The silence that followed was devastating. "Who told you that?" the Duke asked. His voice had gone very quiet, the dangerous kind of quiet. "No one told me. You heard Hartigan in my study." She said nothing. Her silence was confirmation enough. The Duke stood up. He walked around the table. He knelt, the Duke of Kingsley knelt, on the dining room floor, beside her chair, and he took both her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said. "I am going to say this once, because I am not a man who repeats himself, and I need you to hear every word." His grey eyes held hers. There was no coldness in them, no composure, no mask, just him. "I did not marry you out of pity. I married you because you are the only woman in England who has ever made me feel anything at all. I married you because I watched you read Dante in a morning room while your family treated you as furniture, and I thought, there is the bravest person I have ever seen. I married you because when you stood on that platform in a veil, and the whole room laughed, you did not flinch, and I wanted to burn that room to the ground for making you endure it. I married you because you are brilliant and kind and stubborn, and the sound of your voice in the library makes my chest ache in a way I did not know was possible." His hands tightened around hers. "The Ton can call this whatever they like. A charity match, a pity marriage, a novelty. I do not care what they call it, because they are wrong. They are wrong about you, as they have always been wrong about you. You are not the ugly duckling, Viola. You never were. You are the only person in the room worth seeing, and I have known that for 3 years, and I will know it for the rest of my life." Viola was crying. She did not try to hide it. She sat in her chair, with tears running down her freckled face, and the Duke of Kingsley kneeling at her feet, holding her hands as if they were the most precious things he had ever touched. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry. Be angry. Someone made you believe you were not enough. I intend to spend the rest of our lives proving them wrong." He kissed her hands. Then he stood, pulled her to her feet, and held her against his chest. She pressed her face into the hollow of his throat and breathed him in, cedar and ink and warmth, and the old architecture crumbled. The invisible girl faded. In her place stood a woman who was held, who was wanted, who was loved with the same terrifying precision that the Duke of Kingsley brought to everything. "I have something to tell you," she said against his chest. "Tonight, after dinner, something about my family." She felt his arms tighten around her, felt the shift in his body, from tenderness to readiness, from husband to weapon. "Tell me," he said. And she was terrified, not of him, of what would happen when she told him the truth. Because the truth was waiting. The truth was always waiting, and Viola had promised to tell it. "I know what you're thinking. Why didn't she just tell him? She was safe now. She was married. She was a duchess. What could possibly be so terrible that she was afraid to tell the man who had chosen her, who had watched her for 3 years, who had spent £1,000 on a woman in a veil? Keep listening. The moment came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the wedding. They had dined together, roast lamb and early peas from the kitchen garden, a claret that Viola was developing a taste for. And they were sitting in the library, which had become their evening habit. He read correspondence. She read whatever she wanted. The fire crackled. The candles burned low. And the silence between them was the comfortable, lived-in silence of 2 people who had begun to fit together. "Cornelius," she said. He looked up. He always looked up when she said his name, immediately, completely, as if nothing in his correspondence or his duchy or his 45,000 a year could compete with the sound of her voice. "It is time," she said. "I promised to tell you, after the wedding." He set down his papers. He leaned forward. His grey eyes were very steady. "Tell me." Viola pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop them shaking. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it 100 times. It did not help. "My mother," she began, "Lady Sylvia. Everyone believes she died in childbirth, bringing Delphine into the world. That is what my father told society. That is what the parish records show. That is the story I grew up hearing." She paused. The fire cracked. "It is a lie." The Duke said nothing. He waited. "My mother did not die in childbirth. She survived. She survived the birth. She recovered. She held Delphine. She nursed her for 2 months. I remember this, Cornelius. I was 7 years old, but I remember her holding the baby. I remember her laughing. I remember her being alive." The room was very quiet. And then one morning she was gone. "My father said she had taken ill in the night." "A fever," he said, "sudden and violent. The doctor came and went. The funeral was held 3 days later, closed casket. I was not permitted to see her. I was told to be brave and to stop asking questions." Viola's voice had gone flat. She was reciting facts now. the way she had taught herself to recite facts, with distance, with precision, with the studied detachment of someone who has learned that feeling the truth is more dangerous than speaking it. I believed him. I was 7. I believed everything he told me. I believed it for 16 years. What changed? The Duke asked. Last autumn, November, I was in the attic at Ashcroft Hall looking for my mother's books. I had read everything else in the house, and I remembered she had kept a collection of French novels that Sir Piers had boxed up after her death. I found the books, and behind them, in a trunk that had been pushed against the wall and covered with old curtains, I found her letters. She looked at him, brown eyes meeting grey. Letters she had written from a private sanatorium in Norfolk, dated after her supposed death. Letters begging my father to let her come home. Letters saying she was not mad, that she had never been mad, that he had committed her because she had threatened to leave him and take us with her. Letters that stopped in 1832. The silence in the library was total. 1832, the Duke repeated. 5 years after I was told she died. 5 years during which my mother was alive, locked in a sanatorium, writing letters that no one answered. And after 1832? Viola's composure cracked, just for a moment, just enough for him to see the devastation beneath. I don't know. The letters stop. I don't know if she died there or if she is still alive. I don't know anything except that my father lied. He committed my mother to a madhouse because she wanted to leave him, and he told his children she was dead, and he kept her letters in a trunk in the attic for 16 years. Now, I need you to understand something about this moment because it explains everything that follows. In 1847 England, a husband had the legal authority to commit his wife to a private asylum without any medical opinion whatsoever. He simply had to sign the paperwork. The woman had no right to protest, no right to appeal, no right to contact anyone outside. Private asylums were businesses. They were paid by the families who committed patients, and they had no incentive to release those patients because every month a patient remained was another month of income. Women were committed for wanting divorces, for arguing with their husbands, for reading too many novels, for what doctors called hysteria and what we might call having an opinion. The system was a machine for making inconvenient women disappear, and it operated with the full weight of English law behind it. Viola's mother had been fed into that machine, and Viola had only just discovered it. The Duke of Kingsley had not moved. He sat in his chair with his hands on the armrests and his grey eyes fixed on Viola's face, and he was perfectly, terrifyingly still. The kind of stillness that comes before violence, the kind of stillness that Viola had seen in thunderclouds before lightning splits the sky. "His name," the Duke said. "You know his name. I want you to say it. Sir Piers Ashcroft, my father." The Duke nodded once. The movement was small and precise and contained something that made the air in the library feel dangerous. "Is there more?" "Yes." Viola's voice was barely a whisper now. "The money, the debts, they are not from the railway scheme. That is a lie too. The £14,000, some of it is gambling, some of it is the sanatorium. He has been paying them for 20 years to keep her locked away. The debts are the cost of my mother's imprisonment." Something happened to the Duke of Kingsley's face. It was subtle, a tightening around the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a change so small that someone who did not know him might have missed it entirely. But Viola had spent 3 weeks studying this man's face the way she studied everything. Carefully, thoroughly, with the devoted attention of someone who has finally found a subject worthy of her intelligence. And she saw it. She saw fury. Not the hot, explosive fury of a man who shouts and breaks things. The cold, absolute, architectural fury of a man who builds things, specifically who builds instruments of destruction with the same precision and patience that other men use to build cathedrals. "You married me," Viola said, "to save the estate, to save the servants and the tenants, but also because if I told you before the wedding, you would have destroyed him, and the estate would have been lost, and everyone who depended on it would have suffered." "Yes. You chose to protect them even though it meant protecting him." "Yes." "That," the Duke said quietly, "is the most selfless and infuriating thing anyone has ever done." He stood up. He walked to the fireplace. He placed both hands on the mantelpiece and stood there with his head bowed and his shoulders rigid and the firelight casting his face in sharp, angular shadow. He did not speak for a long time. Viola watched him. She watched the way his knuckles went white against the marble. She watched the way his shoulders rose and fell with breaths that were too controlled, too deliberate, the breathing of a man forcing himself to stay whole. 20 years, he said. His voice was different, not cold, not quiet, something she had never heard before, rough, fractured, as if the words were cutting him on the way out. "Your mother has been alive for 20 years, writing letters, asking to come home, and no one—" He stopped. His head dropped lower, his shoulders shook. Viola had seen the Duke of Kingsley terrify a ballroom into silence. She had seen him dismantle a man's confidence with a single sentence. She had seen him command rooms and control conversations and bend the world to his will with the force of his composure alone. She had never seen him break, but he was breaking now, quietly, silently, the way that men who have never allowed themselves to cry finally cry, not with sound, but with the whole body, the grief moving through him like a wave through stone. His hands were still gripping the mantelpiece. His head was still bowed, but his shoulders were shaking and his breathing had gone ragged, and when Viola crossed the room and put her hand on his back, she felt the tremor running through him like an earthquake that had no surface expression. "Cornelius," she whispered. He turned to her. His face was wet. The grey eyes that had never shown anything but control, cold control, warm control, dangerous control, tender control, but always, always control, were red-rimmed and devastated and utterly undefended. "She was alone," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "For 20 years, she was alone in a room writing letters to children who thought she was dead, and your father—" He could not finish. Viola had expected fury. She had expected the cold, architectural rage of a man building an instrument of destruction. She had prepared herself for the Duke. She had not prepared herself for the man. He pulled her against him, not with the careful precision of a man who was always in control, but with the desperate, shaking grip of someone who needed to hold on to something real. And he pressed his face into her hair, and he wept. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way that grief sounds when it has been stored in a man who does not allow himself to feel and has suddenly, catastrophically felt everything at once. Viola held him. She held the most powerful man in England while he cried in the firelight of their library, and she understood, with a clarity that rearranged everything she thought she knew about him, that this was not weakness. This was the thing that made him different from her father, from every cold and powerful man who had ever used his authority to crush the people beneath him. Cornelius Drayton felt things. He felt them enormously, devastatingly, with his whole being. He simply never let anyone see. Until now, until her. The weeping lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then she felt him straighten, felt the control reassemble itself, not like a mask going on, but like a blade being drawn. He pulled back. He looked at her. His eyes were still wet, but behind the grief something else had arrived, something cold and bright and absolutely terrifying. "I will find your mother," he said. His voice was steady again, steady and quiet and lethal. Viola's breath caught. "If she is alive, I will bring her home. If she is dead, I will know how and when, and at whose hands. I will obtain the letters. I will engage solicitors. I will gather every piece of evidence that exists against your father, the false death, the illegal commitment, the financial fraud, the years of deception, and I will construct a case so thorough, so devastating, so completely inescapable that Sir Piers Ashcroft will not merely be punished." He turned to look at her. "He will be erased." "Cornelius." "You have been invisible for 23 years, he said. His voice was very quiet and very fierce. "Your mother has been invisible for 20. I'm going to make your father visible. I'm going to make every terrible thing he has done visible, and then I'm going to make him disappear." Viola stood up from her chair. She crossed the room to where he stood. She put her hand on his cheek, on the skin that was still damp from tears he would never acknowledge again, and she looked up into his face. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," said the Duke of Kingsley. "This isn't kindness, this is what I am." And there it was. The thing that made the Duke of Kingsley different from every other powerful man Viola had ever known. Other men used power the way children use toys, carelessly, selfishly, for their own entertainment. Cornelius used power the way a surgeon uses a blade, precisely, deliberately, and always in service of something larger than himself. He was not kind. He would have been insulted by the word. He was just. And justice, in the hands of a man with £45,000 a year and the ruthlessness to use it, was a force more terrifying than any army. Now, I want to be honest with you. When I was writing this part of the story, I struggled with something. I struggled with the question of whether Viola should have told him sooner, before the wedding, before the contracts were signed, before she was legally bound to a man she barely knew. And then I remembered something. I remembered that Viola Ashcroft had spent 23 years learning that the world punished honesty. That every time she had spoken up, spoken out, shown who she really was, the world had responded by looking through her. She had learned, painfully, systematically, that vulnerability was dangerous, and she had made a calculation. She had decided that protecting the people who depended on her father's estate was worth more than protecting herself. That is not deception. That is sacrifice. And there is a difference. She kissed him then, for the first time. Not on the knuckles, not on the hand, not the formal, careful contact of a man honoring a contract. She kissed him on the mouth, standing on her toes to reach, her hand still pressed against his heart, and the Duke of Kingsley, the most feared man in England, the man who made grown men pale with a glance, made a sound against her mouth that was so unguarded, so raw, so human, that it broke something open inside her. His arms came around her, not gently, fiercely, desperately, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was tilting. He pulled her against him and kissed her back with a hunger that had been building for 3 years of watching, 3 weeks of waiting, and a lifetime of being alone. "Viola," he said against her mouth, just her name. But the way he said it, the way it cracked in the middle, the way it sounded like both a prayer and a surrender, told her everything she needed to know about the Duke of Kingsley's heart. He loved her. He loved her, and he was going to war. The investigation took 6 weeks, 6 weeks during which the Duke of Kingsley became a machine, precise, tireless, methodical. His solicitor, a man named Hartigan, who had served the Kingsley family for 30 years and had never once seen his employer display emotion, later described those weeks as the most terrifying professional experience of his life. During those 6 weeks, while his solicitors were dismantling Sir Piers Ashcroft's life piece by piece, Viola expected the Duke to disappear into his work. She expected the cold, focused man she had married to emerge from behind the tender one she had discovered, and she braced herself for the distance. It did not come. Instead, on the fourth morning of the investigation, Viola came down to the library to find a book on her reading desk. Not just any book. A first edition of Montaigne's essay. The one she had mentioned wanting to read 3 weeks ago, in a conversation she was not even certain he had been listening to. Tucked inside the front cover was a note in his sharp, slanted handwriting. Viola Tricolor, Wild Pansy, named for you, though I suspect you already knew that. See. She held the note for a very long time. Then she pressed it inside her journal, where she would keep it for the rest of her life. He never mentioned it. He never asked if she liked it. He simply continued every morning to leave something on her desk. A single flower, a book, a sketch of a bird he had seen on his morning ride that he thought she would want to identify. Small, silent, daily proof that even while he was systematically destroying a man's life, he was thinking about her. Always thinking about her. And on a Wednesday evening in late May, standing in the library doorway watching her read by the last light of the longest day, he said, quietly, without preamble, in the same voice he used for everything, "I love you, Viola." She looked up. "I know," she said. "I've known since the library, since you said, 'They're yours.'" "How inconvenient," he said. "I had planned a much longer speech." She laughed. He crossed the room and kissed her, and the speech was never delivered. Now I know what some of you might be wondering. What about their nights together? Let me tell you. The Duke of Kingsley, who was cold and controlled and terrifying in every drawing room in England, was none of those things when the bedroom door closed. He was patient, he was tender, he was, in the words Viola wrote in her journal years later, devastatingly attentive to matters of the heart and of the body both. She had spent 23 years being unwanted, being wanted with the intensity of a man who had watched her for 3 years and married her in 4 days and was now systematically destroying her enemies while simultaneously sourcing rare books for her reading pleasure, was intoxicating. But I should tell you about the jealousy. It happened at a dinner. The Duke of Kingsley had arranged a gathering at Kingsley Park. A small affair. 20 guests, carefully selected members of the local gentry and a few London acquaintances, as Viola's introduction to society as the new Duchess of Kingsley. She had been nervous. She had told him she was nervous, standing in their bedroom in a gown of deep green silk that the dressmaker had made to her measurements, not Delphine's, not anyone else's, hers. And the Duke had looked at her and said, "You are the Duchess of Kingsley. They should be nervous of you." The dinner went well, better than well. Viola discovered that she was, when not actively being humiliated by her own family, quite good at conversation. She spoke to a naturalist about migratory birds. She discussed the corn laws with a local magistrate. She made the vicar's wife laugh so hard the woman had to excuse herself. And then Lord Stanworth arrived late. Lord Stanworth was young, 26, handsome, the kind of effortless, aristocratic charm that came from never having been told no. He had golden hair and an easy smile, and the particular confidence of a man who had never met a woman who didn't find him delightful. He took one look at the new Duchess of Kingsley and decided she was fascinating. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over her hand. His lips lingered a fraction of a second too long on her glove. "I must tell you, you are not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" Viola asked. "Honestly?" "A beauty." He grinned. "Instead, I find something much more interesting. You have the most expressive face I have ever seen. Every thought you think shows in your eyes. I cannot look away." It was a compliment, a genuine one, delivered with warmth and wit and the easy confidence of a man who had never been afraid of a duke in his life. And it landed on Viola like sunlight on frozen ground. Not because she wanted Lord Stanworth, but because she had spent 23 years hearing that her face was unremarkable, and here was a handsome young lord telling her that her face was the most interesting thing in the room. She smiled. She should not have smiled. But she had spent so many years not being smiled at that the reflex was automatic. Lord Stanworth saw the smile and leaned closer. "Would you walk with me in the garden, Your Grace? The roses are spectacular at this hour, and I confess I have a particular interest in botany that—" She would not. The voice came from directly behind Viola's left shoulder. She had not heard him approach. No one had heard him approach. The Duke of Kingsley moved through rooms the way weather moved through landscapes. You did not notice the change until the temperature dropped. "Stanworth," the Duke said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were not. His eyes were the grey of a blade, and they were fixed on the younger man's face with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been warmer, but something colder and more absolute. The expression of a man calculating exactly how many ways he could destroy another man and selecting the most efficient. "Kingsley, wonderful dinner. I was just telling your Duchess how captivating she is." "Yes," the Duke said. "I heard." His hand found the small of Viola's back. Not the light, guiding touch she was used to. This was possessive. His fingers spread wide across the fabric of her dress, claiming the space, claiming her. She could feel the heat of his palm through the silk. "And I heard you invite my wife to walk with you in my garden, alone, at night." Each word was delivered with the precision of a nail being driven into a coffin. Lord Stanworth's grin faded. Not all at once. It died in stages, like a candle in a draught, as the full weight of who he was speaking to settled over him. "I meant no offence, Your Grace. It was merely you looking at what is mine and imagining, for one deluded moment, that she might be available." The Duke's voice had not risen. It had dropped, which was infinitely more terrifying. "She is not available. She will never be available, and if you address her again with that particular smile, I will ensure that every door in London closes to you permanently. Do we understand each other?" Lord Stanworth went white. "Perfectly, Your Grace." "Good. I believe you were looking for your seat. It is at the far end of the table, as far from my wife as the room allows." Lord Stanworth went. "Later in their bedroom, later in—" Viola turned on him. "You cannot terrify every man who speaks to me." "I can," the Duke said, "and I will." Cornelius, he was being kind. He was not being kind. He was being charming, which is an entirely different thing. Kind is what Mrs. Bramwell is. Charming is what men are when they want something that does not belong to them. "I am not a thing that belongs to you." "No," the Duke said, and something shifted in his voice. The cold authority giving way to something rawer, more vulnerable. "You are not a thing. You are everything. And the thought of another man looking at you the way he was looking at you makes me want to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been hanging at his sides, curled into fists. "Makes you want to what?" He crossed the room in 2 strides. His hand cupped the back of her neck. His mouth found hers, not gentle this time, not careful, but fierce and hot and claiming. And when he pulled back, his breathing was ragged, and his eyes were wild. "Mine," he said against her lips. "You are mine, Viola. You have always been mine, and I do not share." She should have objected. She should have reminded him that jealousy was irrational, that she was perfectly capable of managing a conversation with a young lord without needing to be rescued. That possessiveness was not the same as love. Instead, she said, "Prove it." He proved it, thoroughly. And when they lay tangled together afterward, breathless and trembling, Viola pressed her face into his shoulder and whispered, "For the record, I didn't want to walk in the garden with him." "I know. I wanted to come upstairs with you." His arm tightened around her. "Then why did you smile at him?" "Because no one ever called my face interesting before, except you." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, "Then I have not been saying it often enough." After that, he told her every day, not in grand declarations. That was not his way, but in the quiet observations that punctuated their hours together. "You look extraordinary in that light. Your frown, when you concentrate, is the most fascinating thing I have ever seen. If you keep biting your lip while you read, I will not be responsible for what happens next." Small statements, delivered in his flat, certain voice that accumulated over the days like stones building a wall between Viola and the 23 years of invisibility that had come before. The investigation concluded on a Friday. Mr. Hartigan arrived at Kingsley Park with a leather case containing documents that would, over the following weeks, detonate like bombs across English society. The Duke read them at his desk while Viola sat across from him. She watched his face. She watched the cold fury build behind his eyes as he turned each page. "Your mother," he said finally, "is alive." The sound that came out of Viola was not a word. It was something older and deeper than language. The sound of a woman who had been told her mother was dead for 16 years, discovering that the world had been lying. "She is in a private sanatorium in Norfolk, Beechcroft House. She has been there for 20 years. She is in good health, considering. She has been asking to leave since the day she arrived." Viola's hands were over her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. "Hartigan has obtained sworn statements from 2 former attendants confirming that she was committed without medical examination at the sole request of her husband, and that she has shown no symptoms of madness at any point during her confinement. He has also obtained the financial records showing that Sir Piers has been paying Beechcroft House £300 per year, £6,000 total, to keep her imprisoned." The Duke set down the papers. "Your father committed a sane woman to an asylum to prevent her from leaving him. He then told his children she was dead. He maintained the lie for 20 years. He used the financial burden of her imprisonment as the excuse for debts he blamed on railway speculation. And when those debts became unmanageable, he attempted to auction his eldest daughter to the highest bidder." He looked at Viola. "There is one more thing." "What?" "Delphine. The reason your father favoured her so completely, the reason he treated you as invisible from the moment she was born." The Duke paused. "She is not his daughter." The room tilted. "What?" "Your mother's letters, the later ones. She writes about it directly. Delphine's father was a man named Captain George Fellows, a cavalry officer your mother had known before her marriage. The affair was brief. Your father discovered the truth shortly after Delphine's birth, which is why he committed your mother. Not because she threatened to leave, because she had produced evidence of his humiliation. But he raised Delphine. He adored her. He raised a beautiful golden child who looked nothing like him and everything like the man who had cuckolded him. He adored her because society adored her, and society's adoration of Delphine reflected glory on him. He despised you because you looked like your mother, the woman who had betrayed him. Every time he looked at you, he saw her." Viola sat very still. The library was silent except for the fire. She was 23 years old, and the entire architecture of her life, every cruelty, every dismissal, every year of invisibility was rearranging itself into a pattern that finally, devastatingly, made sense. She was not the ugly duckling. She had never been the ugly duckling. She had been the reminder, the living, breathing, brown-eyed reminder of a woman her father had tried to erase from existence. "What do you want to do?" the Duke asked. Viola looked at him, brown eyes blazing with something that was not grief and was not rage, but was something newer, fiercer, something that had teeth. "I want my mother," she said, "and I want him to burn." "Then that," the Duke of Kingsley said, "is what will happen." He kissed her forehead. His lips lingered there, warm, steady, a promise pressed into skin. And Viola closed her eyes and leaned into him and allowed herself, for the first time in her life, to believe that she was safe. The Duke did not sleep that night. Viola knew, because she did not sleep either, and when she went looking for him at 3 in the morning, she found him in his study, writing letters by candlelight. 6 letters, each sealed with the Kingsley crest, each containing instructions so precise that the men who received them would later say they read them with their hands shaking. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. The candlelight softened his features, making him look less like a weapon and more like a man. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep well. I never have." Viola sat in the chair beside his desk. She tucked her feet beneath her and said, "Then I'll sit with you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and continued writing, and Viola sat beside him in the quiet, candle-lit study, and they were together in the silence. And the silence was enough. "I have to pause here and tell you, this scene, this quiet moment at 3 in the morning, is why I write these stories. Not the grand gestures, not the ballroom speeches, not the revenge. This. 2 people sitting together in the dark because neither of them can sleep and neither of them wants to be alone. That is love, not the declaration, the presence. The rescue of Lady Sylvia came first. The Duke rode to Norfolk himself. Viola went with him. They arrived at Beechcroft House on a Tuesday morning, a grim building of grey stone surrounded by high walls, the kind of place designed to contain people and suffocate hope. And the Duke walked through the front door without knocking, presented his card to the matron and said, in a voice that permitted no argument, "You will bring me Lady Sylvia Ashcroft immediately, and you will prepare a full account of every payment received, every medical record kept, and every communication sent or withheld during her time in your care. My solicitors will expect these documents by Friday." The matron's face went white. She brought Lady Sylvia. Viola had been 7 years old the last time she saw her mother. She was 23 now. 16 years had passed. 16 years of letters that went unanswered, of walls that never changed, of asking to go home and being told, gently or otherwise, that she did not have a home. Lady Sylvia was thin. Her hair had gone grey. Her hands shook. But her eyes, brown eyes, Viola's eyes, were sharp and clear and absolutely, unmistakably sane. She was wearing a plain cotton dress that was clean but colourless, the uniform of an institution. Her wrists were narrow, the bones visible beneath papery skin. She moved slowly, carefully, the way a person moves when they have spent 20 years in small rooms and have forgotten what it feels like to walk without reaching a wall. But when she saw Viola, she stopped. She stopped in the corridor of Beechcroft House, and her hands flew to her mouth, and her brown eyes, Viola's eyes, exactly Viola's eyes, went wide with a recognition that was not instant, but devastating. Because the last time Sylvia had seen her daughter, Viola had been 7 years old and small enough to carry. And now she was 23 and tall and standing in a sanatorium corridor with tears streaming down her face and the Kingsley diamonds at her throat. "Viola?" Her mother's voice was hoarse from disuse. It cracked on the second syllable. "My Viola?" "Mama," Viola said, and then she could not say anything else because her mother's arms were around her and they were both weeping and 16 years of silence were breaking apart like ice in spring. The Duke stood in the corridor and watched. Them and Mr. Hartigan, who was standing beside him, later swore, though he would never say so publicly, that the Duke of Kingsley's eyes were bright with something that might, in a lesser man, have been tears. They brought Lady Sylvia home to Kingsley Park. They installed her in the most beautiful guest suite. They brought her food and books and sunlight and the sound of bird song and all the ordinary precious things that 20 years of imprisonment had stolen from her. And while she recovered, slowly, carefully, tended by Viola and Mrs. Bramwell and a physician the Duke had personally recruited from London, the Duke of Kingsley went to war. He did not hurry. He was not the kind of man who hurried. He was the kind of man who built. Now, I need to tell you something about what happened to women like Lady Sylvia, because it is one of the darkest chapters in English history, and it is a chapter your history books may not have taught you. Private asylums in the 1840s were not hospitals. They were prisons with better furniture. A husband, a father, or a male guardian could commit any woman to a private asylum simply by signing a form. No medical examination was required, no second opinion, no judicial oversight. The woman had no right to appeal, no right to a hearing, no right to contact anyone outside the walls. Thousands of perfectly sane women were committed every year. Women who had argued with their husbands, women who had inherited inconvenient fortunes, women who had simply become unwanted. The Lunacy Commission, which was supposed to oversee these institutions, was understaffed, underfunded, and widely regarded as useless. It was not until 1845 that Parliament passed the Lunacy Act, requiring proper medical certification, and even then the enforcement was patchy at best. Lady Sylvia entered Beechcroft House in 1827, nearly 2 decades before even those modest protections existed. She entered a system designed to make women disappear, and for 20 years the system worked exactly as intended, until the Duke of Kingsley decided it would not work any longer. But what happened next, what the Duke did at the Pemberton Ball, is something I still cannot believe he had the nerve to do, and I think it might be the most satisfying moment in any story I have ever told on this channel. Keep listening. The first blow fell at a dinner party in London. Sir Piers, who had been enjoying the reflected glory of having a daughter married to a duke, arrived to find that every person who had previously accepted his invitations now suddenly had prior engagements. Doors that had been open for 30 years were suddenly, quietly, permanently closed. The whisper campaign had begun. Not crude gossip, but the precise, surgical deployment of truth. Sir Piers Ashcroft committed his wife to an asylum. Sir Piers Ashcroft told his children she was dead. Sir Piers Ashcroft's debts are not from railways. The second blow was financial. The Duke's solicitors called in every debt Sir Piers owed, bought the mortgages on his properties, acquired his notes of hand from the gambling houses. Within a week, Sir Piers Ashcroft was financially surrounded, every avenue of credit closed, every asset encumbered, every escape route blocked with the precision of a military campaign. The third blow was legal. The magistrate received a formal complaint, accompanied by sworn testimony, documentary evidence, and the personal endorsement of the Duke of Kingsley, alleging that Sir Piers Ashcroft had illegally committed a sane woman to a private asylum, defrauded his family, falsified a death, and engaged in a pattern of cruelty so systematic that it constituted criminal conduct. And the final blow, the one that destroyed Sir Piers Ashcroft completely, came at the grandest ball of the London season. The Duke of Kingsley did not attend balls. Everyone knew this. The Duke of Kingsley had not danced in public in a decade. The Duke of Kingsley regarded social events with the same enthusiasm most people reserved for dental surgery. But on the 14th of June, 1847, the Duke and Duchess of Kingsley walked into the Pemberton Ball, the same house where 2 months earlier Viola had stood on an auction platform in a black veil while society laughed, and every person in the room stopped breathing. Viola wore gold, a gown of amber silk that caught the candlelight and turned her skin to honey, with the Kingsley diamonds at her throat. Diamonds so famous they had a name, the Frostfire Necklace, a waterfall of ice-white stones that had not been worn by a Duchess of Kingsley in 40 years. Her hair was up, her chin was lifted, and she was holding the arm of the most powerful man in England, who was looking at her as if the room, the ball, the entirety of English society existed solely as a backdrop for her. Do you remember what they called her? The ugly duckling, the plain one, the other Ashcroft daughter. They had laughed when she stood on that platform. They had whispered and snickered and placed no bids and watched her humiliation with the casual cruelty of people who have never known what it means to be unwanted. None of them were laughing now, because walking behind the Duke and Duchess of Kingsley on the arm of Mr. Hartigan was a woman. A thin, grey-haired woman with brown eyes and a straight spine and a face that many of the older guests in the room recognized with dawning, horrified shock. Lady Sylvia Ashcroft, who had been dead for 16 years, who was very much alive. And standing at the far end of the ballroom, a glass of champagne halfway to his lips, frozen in place as if he had been struck by lightning, was Sir Piers Ashcroft. The Duke walked his wife to the centre of the ballroom. He stopped. He turned to face the room. And in a voice that carried to every corner, that quiet, precise, devastating voice, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, many of you were present 2 months ago when my wife was put on an auction stage and mocked. You called her the ugly duckling. You laughed. Not one of you bid a single penny for her company." The room was silent. "I want you to know what you were laughing at. You were laughing at a woman who had endured 23 years of cruelty at the hands of a father who committed her mother, Lady Sylvia, whom many of you believed dead, to a private asylum because she dared to defy him. You were laughing at a woman who chose to stand on that stage, veiled and humiliated, to save the servants and tenants who depended on her family's estate. You were laughing at a woman with more courage, more intelligence, and more grace than this entire room combined." He paused. His grey eyes found Sir Piers across the ballroom. "And the man who put her there, who lied to his children, who imprisoned his wife, who auctioned his daughter like livestock, is standing among you right now, drinking your champagne and wearing your approval like a mask." The silence broke. It broke into 100 whispers, 1,000 turning heads, a tidal wave of shock and outrage and the particular fury of people who have just discovered they have been deceived. Sir Piers dropped his glass. It shattered on the marble floor. The sound was very small and very final. "Constables are waiting outside," the Duke said, his voice still perfectly calm. "They have a warrant." Sir Piers tried to run. He did not get far. The crowd, the same crowd that had laughed at his daughter 2 months ago, parted to let the constables through and closed behind them like a wall. It was, by all accounts, the most devastating social destruction anyone had witnessed in a generation. Viola watched her father being led from the ballroom. She watched the man who had made her invisible, who had imprisoned her mother, who had sold her on a stage and called her worthless, stumble between two officers of the law with his face the colour of ash and his reputation in ruins around him like broken glass. She felt Cornelius's hand tighten around hers. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. Viola thought about it. She thought about the attic at Ashcroft Hall where she had found the letters. She thought about the platform and the veil and the laughter. She thought about her mother in the sanatorium, writing letters that no one read, asking to come home to children who thought she was dead. "I feel," Viola said carefully, "like myself." The Duke looked at her. His grey eyes were warm, genuinely warm, without coldness, without control, without any of the masks he wore for the rest of the world. "You have always been yourself," he said. "The world is simply catching up." He led her onto the dance floor. The orchestra, which had stopped playing during his speech, began again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. A waltz. The Duke, who had not danced in public in 10 years, took his wife in his arms and danced with her in the centre of the Pemberton ballroom, where 2 months ago she had been the woman no one wanted. His hand was warm at the small of her back. His other hand held hers, not delicately, not formally, but firmly, possessively, as if he intended never to let go. They moved together in the amber light of 500 candles, surrounded by the rustle of silk and the scent of beeswax and hothouse roses and the silent, stunned attention of every person in the room. Viola could feel their eyes, every one of them. The women who had whispered, the men who had laughed, the matrons who had called her plain, and the debutantes who had pitied her, and the auctioneers who had begged for a £2 bid. She could feel them watching, and for the first time in her life, she did not mind being watched. Because the man holding her was looking at her as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist, and his grey eyes were warm, and his hand was steady. And when he pulled her a fraction closer, closer than the waltz strictly required, closer than propriety allowed, close enough that she could feel the beat of his heart against her own, he murmured something that only she could hear. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For being you. For being exactly, precisely, stubbornly, magnificently you. For not changing, for not breaking, for surviving them long enough for me to find you." Viola's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. Not here. Not now. She would cry later, in their bedroom, in his arms where no one could see, but not here. Here she would dance. Here she would be the Duchess of Kingsley, wearing gold silk and diamonds and the love of a man who had seen her when the entire world had looked away. The waltz ended. The room erupted into applause. Tentative at first, then thunderous, as if every person in the Pemberton ballroom was trying to atone for their earlier cruelty through the sheer volume of their approval. Every eye in the room was on them. Every mouth was closed. Every person who had ever called Viola Ashcroft the ugly duckling watched her waltz with the most powerful man in England and understood, finally, what they had been too cruel or too careless or too blind to see. She was not the ugly duckling. She had never been the ugly duckling. She was the only one in the room worth looking at. And the Duke of Kingsley had known it all along. In the months that followed, the world rearranged itself around the truth. Sir Piers Ashcroft was tried, convicted of fraud and unlawful imprisonment, and sentenced to transportation. His assets were seized. His name was struck from every guest list, every club membership, every social register in England. He left the country in chains, and no one, not a single person in all of English society, spoke in his defence. Lady Sylvia recovered slowly but completely. She lived at Kingsley Park for the rest of her life, in a suite of rooms overlooking the garden, surrounded by books and birdsong and the grandchildren who would fill the house in the years to come. She and Viola had 16 years of silence to fill, and they filled every minute of it. Delphine returned from Scotland, her elopement in tatters. She arrived at Kingsley Park soaked and shivering, looking nothing like the golden girl who had climbed out of a window 3 months earlier. Viola told her everything about their mother, about their father's lies, about the asylum, and about Captain Fellows. The conversation ended with both sisters on the floor of the library, crying in the particular way that sisters cry when they have finally stopped pretending. "He made us hate each other," Delphine whispered. "He made me believe I was better than you, and he made you believe you were nothing." "And the whole time," Viola said quietly, "we were the only real thing either of us had." "And the Duke of Kingsley?" The Duke of Kingsley continued to be the most feared man in England. He continued to destroy people who deserved it and terrify people who did not. He continued to buy rare books and argue about poetry and look at his wife as if she were the only source of light in any room she entered. But he also did something else, something that no one expected. He laughed, quietly, and only at home. And only when Viola said something particularly sharp or particularly tender or particularly Viola. But he laughed. And the servants at Kingsley Park, who had served the Drayton family for generations and had never once heard the sound of laughter in those ancient halls, agreed that it was the most remarkable thing any of them had ever witnessed. As you step away from this story, I want you to think about something. Have you ever been overlooked? Not hated, not attacked, but simply overlooked, passed over, looked through, treated as if you were not quite there. And have you ever wondered what would happen if someone, just one person, truly saw you? That is what the Duke of Kingsley did. He walked into a room full of people who had decided Viola Ashcroft was invisible. And he saw her. He saw her reading Dante. He saw her giving her coat away. He saw her standing on that auction platform with her spine straight and her dignity intact while the whole world laughed. And he decided, with the same cold, absolute certainty he brought to everything, that she was the most extraordinary woman in England. He was right. Thank you for being here, for listening, for being part of this community that stretches across the world. If this story made you feel something, tell me about it in the comments. What moment hit you the hardest? And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. I'd love to have you here for the next story. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, the right person will never need you to wear a veil.